Thursday, July 24th, which I really hope that's today. Learning is sponsored in memory of the second yahrzeit of Rose Friedman from Pretoria, London, and Jerusalem. Razel Bat Asher, by her children who miss her every day. So let's hope that the shir will be Le'ilui Nishmata. So this week we have two parshot, Matot and Maseh. Also Shabbat will be Rosh Chodesh Av, which makes things a little bit more complicated and a little bit more interesting. But all the various halachic issues we will leave aside. And instead I want to focus, I would say one thing, but that one thing is really Parshat Matot and Maseh, although really more Matot than Maseh. And we'll start just with the first acknowledgement that the word mateh or matot is not one which is a usual term, and it's used in the beginning of the parsha in a whole issue about vows and canceling vows, but then it also comes up in the next section when it talks about going off to war, and it uses it almost, I would say, as something which is synonymous with the word shevet. So if we look at source number 1, Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lamer, Nikom Nikmat Bnei Yisrael Me'eta Midyanim. Right there we want to pause for a moment, although if you want me to get to the word mateh, you'll notice it coming up in Pasuk Daled. We'll read Gimel, Vaydaber Moshe La'am Lemor, Hechaltzu mi'etchem la'anashim l'tzava, v'yu al Midyan l'tet nikmat Hashem b'Midyan, Elef l'mateh, l'kol matot. So over here, and again, the next pasuk, the word mateh is used, and I'm not going to engage regarding the word mateh. I'm just observing that it's used multiple times in the portion, and it certainly deserves more attention, which it's not receiving from us now. Now, what's interesting is that it says Nikom Nikmat B'nei Yisrael Me'eta Midyanim. And we know that the previous episode, if you look quickly in source number 2, Vayashev Yisrael B'Shittim, V'chel Amlas Notet Benot Moab. And V'tikrena, and not only was there sexual impropriety, then they called them L'zivchei Elohim, to worship their gods, V'yishtachavu L'Elohim, and they worshiped the gods, V'yitzmed Yisrael Baal Pa'or. And Israel had this unfortunate relationship then with Baal Pa'or. Subsequently, in Pasuk Vav, we're told, "V'nei ish mibnei Yisrael bav yikrev el echav et hamidyanit, l'nei Moshe l'nei kol adat bnei Yisrael," and so on. So we have over here a combination of Moab and Midian, and for that matter, we had a combination going all the way back to the beginning of Parshat Balak. And there is confusion and there is intrigue. I mean, just for example, when we met Balak, right? Balak, it's the parsha named after him, and who is Balak? So before you answer, when it begins, we're told some things about him, and then only afterwards it added in this thing which it should have said initially, and it says that Balak ben Tzipor melech Moab ba'etahi. Now that was a strange thing to say, because it should have introduced him as Balak, the king. You don't introduce somebody and just say some other things he sees, he responds, and so on, which leads some to say that it was actually the opposite which happened, is that he was not king, is that rather he was able, again you can think 1930s now if you want, he was able to use his anti-Semitism in order to catapult him, right, create fear and create a whole agenda, then to catapult him to a position of leadership, but he was not leader before all of those things which are described in the first couple of verses. Not only that, by the time we finish today, when I said there's confusion, we're going to also try to get to a point, again, to unravel something. Was he himself a member of Moab? Right? Or was he Austrian? No. Was he a member of Moab, or was he a member of Midian? So you could say, but how does he become the member of, you're not going to use that, are you? That you can't use that. You have to behave a little bit. That how, if he's a member of Midian, how does he become the king of Moab? But that exactly may be what's a little bit more interesting over here. But as I said, there is confusion. So let's just place the confusion aside for a moment. But when I look in Perek Kaf Hey, I have, if anything, the majority of what's taking place, and I'm just I'm focusing on the Hebrew. Vayechel am leznot el benot Moab, and that's plural. And then when I go on and I find Hamidyanit, and that sounds like it's singular. So now when I think about, so who do I need to go and take vengeance on? So I can say both, or I can say primarily Moab. So the fact that over here we're told take vengeance against Midian, that becomes a little bit more interesting. But there's going to be a further complication, which is so bad that it's almost impossible. And you can enjoy yourselves any way that you want to get out of it. But I'm just saying it's something which makes it almost impossible. As we continue over here, we're told that they sent people off to war. And Pasuk Chet, Vayihi Malchei Midian Hargu al Chalaleihem et Evi et Rekam ve'et Sur. So you want to keep your eyes on Sur, right? Just keep the focus on Sur as we move on. Vet Chorad Reva and so on. Chameshet Malchei Midian. Vet Bilam bin Ba'or Hargu b'Charv. And they got Bilam as well. So I guess that he's involved in all this as well. V'yishbu b'nei Yisrael Neshem Midian. And Israel captured some of the women of Midian, Vet Tapam, Vet Kol B'mtam, Vet Kol Miknehem. And then we're told Moshe and Elazar can go out and they survey what has happened. Pasuk Yudalad V'yiksof Moshe al Pikudei Achayil. Moshe is upset with the military leadership. Why? Sarei Lafim and so on. Vayomer le Moshe. Achayitim kol nekeva. You left these women alive. Hein Heina hayu levnei Yisrael b'dvar Bilam. So it's interesting. Bidvar Bilam. Here, if you want Bilam's fingerprints on it as far as Moshe is concerned, they're the ones who were involved in the plot of Bilam, Limsor Ma'al Bahashem, in order to cause this outrage against God, Al Dvar Pa'ar, in order to get the Jews to be guilty of what it's called here Me'ilah, in order to serve a different God or to serve Pa'ar instead of God, Hashem. So it's really interesting, this verse, for various reasons. One, as Moshe is giving us his commentary of what's happened, that he understands that the seduction, which is described in source number 2, that is done at the instructions of Bilam. Secondly, that was actually the plan. So again, I think a lot of us know the midrashic background, but I don't know why we need a midrashic background when you actually have the words over here in the Chumash. The midrashic background is, again, Bilam sees perhaps, Ma tovu lecha Yaakov, how beautiful are the Jewish camps and the Jewish homes and so on. You know, the windows don't even look into one another, which is certainly not many neighborhoods over here, including Har Nof. It's probably the main reason they don't need television there. So, okay. Yeah, what can you do? I've given up, whatever. I used to edit out all of these inappropriate things. I don't edit them out anymore. They're just, they're there. Anyway. Yeah, I think people who hear me when it's recorded and then they hear me live, they say, hold it, is that the same person? And the answer is yes. Excuse me? It makes it real. Just to continue over here, and Bilam sees the positive, so when he sees the positive, he discerns the negative. And he says, hold it, if this is why the Jews are blessed, let's unbless them. And how do you unbless them? You get them to act in the opposite way. So you get them to act in the opposite way, but now you realize that's a strategy. The real thing is to get them to worship idolatry and to get them to reject God, because presumably, if they reject God, then God rejects them. God rejects them. They become then susceptible to whatever will happen in terms of, including going out to battle against them. So I'm saying that verse is really interesting, and perhaps we'll look at it again. Again, which is the secondary point. So what's the problem with all of this? I mean, everything just now made sense. The problem is that he's talking about Midian. And Midian, there was only one Hamidyanit. If you're going to talk about the major problem, that was Moab. So therefore, how and why does Moshe, again, first of all, now we're going backwards. Why are we told to go to war against Midian when Moab was the problem? or the combination was the problem. And if the combination is the problem, then go to war against both of them. Why is Moshe upset for keeping the Midianite women alive? And he's, oh, but they're the ones who went and did it. But they weren't the ones who went and did it, other than perhaps one specific woman, because all the others were coming from Moab. And I said, this is an impossible question to, what? You finally understood the question. Oh, I thought you had the answer there, but no, I'm saying this is a difficult problem. In order, again, if you want to just say that Midian and Moab, it's all the same, but it's not. So what's the matter?
Moshe lived in Midian for so many years. He lived in Moab.
Correct. That's an added factor, but still.
And Yitro and factor.
And Yitro, fine. All of these are facts. They're irrelevant facts, all of them. But they're facts. Fine, they're relevant. These are very relevant facts. But you're giving me more reason to go to war against Moab, which means Moab. This is great. Moab is guilty, and let's go kill Midian. Again, there's something wrong over here. And by the way, you could just ask this by the Shabbos table if it's appropriate. It won't be appropriate, but you could just ask this, and this is the problem. And as I said, Shea b'hatzlacha in getting to an answer. Again, I'm going to offer you some things, but it's.
You're not going to tell us the answer?
You want an answer also? Haven't you always been told that a good question is far more valuable than a good answer?
It's like a real mystery.
So let's continue. Let's then continue. In source number 3, which is really important, source number 3, it's in Devarim. Here we're told not to marry into the Moab family. If we were closer to the holiday of Shavuot, we'd probably have some interesting things to say about this. And keep that in mind, because that's important. Because if we don't have Moab, we don't have Ruth. We don't have Ruth, we don't have David. We don't have David, they want Mashiach. And that means that we will be fasting on Tisha B'Av. Okay, so Lo Yavo Amoni Moavi B'Kal Hashem. Gam Dor Asiri Lo Yavo Lehem B'Kal Hashem Ad Olam. That Moab and Ammon, they're out. By the way, if you go back and look up the context, it's even more interesting, but we're not going there. Al Dvar, so this is also, it's interesting. Didn't we have the same exact formulation in Pasuk Tet Vav in source 1? Al Dvar Pa'or, and here it is, Al Dvar Asher Lo Kidmu Atchem Belechem U'V'Mayim B'Derech B'Tzeitchem Mitzrayim. Because they did not bring you water and bread when you left Egypt, they should have been there for you and taking care of you. And this is unbelievable. This is really unbelievable, because what kind of standard is this? And the answer is actually quite simple. Vasher Sachar Alecha, and not only that, you know what else they did? They hired at Bilam bin Ba'or Miptor Aram Narayim L'Kalaleka. And they hired Bilam. By the way, look who we're talking about now. We're talking about Moab. And look who we blamed before. By the way, we can make a distinction. What? There's two different people, Moab. But they end differently. So one second. So it says, because they're guilty, because they hired Bilam to curse you. Now, if we'll just pause that for a second, over here we read about Bilam. Bilam advised Midian, presumably, regarding Baal Pa'or. So there it's the curse, and here it's the Baal Pa'or. But to try to go and to separate these really seems like a very surgical operation. But it's interesting, because we're reading the Chumash. This is not a commentary. Unless you want to say that Bechlal, Sefer Dvarim is Moshe's commentary. But then it continues, and it says, they hired, right, to curse you. V'lo avo Hashem Elokecha l'shmo et Bilam, and God would not allow Bilam to be listened to. V'yafoch Hashem Elokecha l'cha teklala l'bracha, and God turned his curses into blessings. Why? Ki ahivcha Hashem Elokecha, because God loves you. By the way, that's the takeaway of all of this. And it's so sad, because we read Parshat Balak every year and we forget the takeaway. What's the takeaway of the whole story? You say, what is the most important conclusion of Parshat Balak? And the answer is that God loves you. And you know what God does because he loves you? God protects you. I'm just saying, is that's an unbelievable takeaway from this, but we kind of miss it because then it's not there until Devarim, and it's in the middle of Parshat Kitetse, and Kitetse I think has 57 different mitzvot in it, and this kind of gets lost along the way because we have so many other good ones like what? Like Eshikifat Toar, which everyone wants to talk about. And so we have further perspective and further confusion. This Medrash in source number 4, it says, B'dvar Bilam, Mikana Tolamad, Shabilam Atam Mitzah Shoshivu Hazanot Kadesh Yishtachavu L'Baal Pahar. And now you learn that it was, and by the way, this is commentating back on Parshat Matot, and it says that now you realize it was Bilam who gave the advice to put the Zonot in order to lead to the Baal Pa'ar, and Bilam's responsible. And I'm going to say it again, that you have commentaries and you have midrashim, but in this case, what you really needed to do was actually to read the psukim in the various places and just try to remember. Again, aside from remembering who's Moab and who's Midian, but remembering what the Torah actually says. In source number 5, which is the beginning of Pinchas, it tells us, V'shem ish Yisrael muka shehuka et hamidyanit. Again, in the singular, hamidyanit, is Zimri. V'shem ha'isha muka hamidyanit kozbi bat Sur. Remember I told you to keep your eyes on Sur before? So why was I interested in Sur? Because this is Kozbi bat Sur, and it says Kozbi bat Sur Rosh Umot Beit Av b'Bidyanhu. So that's one way of describing what was another way that he is described as, and that was back in source 1 pasuk Ched Ve'at Malchei Midian, and one of them was Tzur, which means now we could have perhaps a theory. Again, in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Tzorot Midyanim, V'kitim Otam Kitzorim Heim. Right here already we're told, Asher Niklu Lachem Al Dvar Pa'or V'Al Dar Kozbi Bat Nisi Midyan, Achutam. So perhaps the difference is that she is a princess and the other ones are commoners. So perhaps for commoners to act in a common way is one thing, but perhaps for a princess to act in a common way, you like my euphemisms? In a common way is a little bit different. And perhaps it's something which is a difference between quality versus quantity. By the way, that's my answer. That's my final answer. If you like the answer, then great, which means this is a far more strategic act that they will allow this daughter of a king. Again, I don't know what the word king means in this kind of context. I don't know how many followers any of these so-called kings have, but it's obvious that what?
King or president, Rabbi?
I don't know. I don't know what it means. Yeah, but I don't know how many followers you need to have in this kind of context to be called a leader. I don't care what the terminology is. Which means sometimes, you have the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings, which is actually related. You have the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. How many followers did each of those kings have? So you could tell me, I don't know, and I'll say, exactly. And I'll say, okay, what's the minimum that you need to be called a king? Okay, in the modern Middle East, how many followers do you need to have be called a sheikh? I'm asking you. You're an expert.
Don't know.
Exactly. So again, that's the point. Is I don't know how much it is, but it's some kind of a leadership position. But nonetheless, sending the princess out for such a job. And again, there are midrashim that talk about this. And she goes and she's looking for Moshe. And then she said, okay, again, but all that's going back to the point is that this is strategic attack using somebody who is theoretically of a little bit of a higher background. Let me put it again this way, to use people who are on the lowest strata of society to do this perhaps is different. Again, you can argue with me about all of this, but again, if you want me to offer you some kind of a distinction between Moab and Midian, I'll say that Moab, there was a bunch of girls out there who were then trying to lead them towards Avodah Zarah, and on the other hand, here the princess is out there trying to do something else. And again, that's the Medrash, but in order to, yes.
If married into Moab is because the zonut. So my question is, how come at the end it says Moavi v'lo Moavi? It's actually.
Yeah, but by the way, but one second, but that's not what it said.
I know, but.
No, but it's no. Okay, slow. I didn't explain this enough. It says Asher lo kidmu etchem. It's actually very interesting that when the Gemara says, "Oh, what about Moavi lo Moaviyah?" So here's where it actually says Kol kavod bat melech prima. Is that girls that we never expected them to go out? What's actually the issue? The issue is that who is Moab? Moab is from Lot, and who is Lot? Lot learned in Avraham's cheder. Even better than Avraham's cheder, he learned in Avraham's tent. He saw the way that Avraham goes out and greets all of his guests. How does Avram greet his guests? With water and food, and by the way, with tongue and with mustard, and all kinds of things. Which means if you grow up in Avraham's tent, you then have that kind of an education, that kind of a background. You therefore should have that kind of an obligation to behave. Certainly when it comes to Avraham's descendants, which means, again, in this kind of case, having that kind of a background causes an obligation. What Chazal then say is that the girls would normally not go out off into the fields or off into the desert or whatever it was in order to go greet the strangers, and therefore they were not expected to go out, but the men were. And that's really what it says here. It doesn't say the other reasons. It says why? It's because they didn't go out and bring you food, which is really a remarkable statement, but that's what the statement says. In source, okay, we're going to skip a little bit, but in source number 8, it said earlier in Devarim, "Vayomer Hashem Elai, Al Tatzar Moav, Al Titker Ba Milchama, Ki Lo Aten Lachar Tzo Yerusha, Ki Livnei Lot Natati Et Ar Yerusha." So here you have a really interesting combination and complexity. On the one hand, you can't marry into these people because of the way that they behaved or didn't behave. On the other hand, you can't take their land because that land was given to Lot. Now, keep that in mind. And what else do we need? A couple of more points. One is in source number 5, is where we had seen just before, and that's where it's the Kozbi Bat Nasi. Rashi here is commenting here on Pasuk Perek Kafeh, where it says to go to war and to take against Midian. Here it says Vet Moav Lot Siva Lashmid Mipnei Rut Shaita Atida Letzeit Mehem. Remarkable statement. Doesn't draw a moral distinction between the two. It says we still need them around. It's essentially God is saying, listen, I got a great book. Actually, I have a trilogy, right? And if you want to know how the whole thing's going to work out, there's a character that wasn't born yet that we're going to need, and therefore we can't wipe them out yet. We can't write them off the script right now because we're going to need them down the line. That is absolutely an unbelievable comment over here by Rashi, but nonetheless, that's what it says, and it's based on the Gemara. You're intrigued.
I want to make sure I'm following. There's 2 reasons why we can't destroy Moab: the past, in Lot, and the future, meaning Ruth. And Midian.
Yeah.
Midian, there's no future.
So one second. So
So
slow down.
There is a past and we're ignoring it.
So slow down for 1 second. When it comes to Moab, we have to be careful in terms of the past that we're told in Devarim. Right over here, Rashi is commenting, what's the distinction between the two of them is that we're going to need them. On the other hand, Rashi in Dvarim is going to give 2 answers. So it's interesting. Over here, Rashi only gave 1, but when it comes to source number 9, which is Rashi on Perek Bet in Dvarim, he says, don't go to war against them, but he does say you can instill fear in them, which means that's a good thing to do. Right? Lo asar lehem al moav ela milchama. Let them know that you have guns pointed at them. Let them know that you're ready to take them out. You can't do it, but don't let them know that you can't do it. So there's also some interesting strategy being expressed over here. And therefore Moab was terrified. Why were they terrified? Because we're pointing our guns at them. And the makes distinction between Moab and Ammon that doesn't concern me all that much. Continue. the Maharal in source number 10, he goes through the different interpretations, and he says it is because of Avraham, although we're not going to read the whole thing, you have it in front of you. Again, if you don't know, the Maharal, the Gur Aryeh, this is the famous Maharal. This is a commentary on Rashi. So that Rashi that explained what he said, he knows the various Rashi, so he tries to explain it. So he says, oh, well, because of the past, we can't go to war against them, but maybe when they went to war against us, maybe they then forfeited their status, and then he goes into different ways of understanding. If one says, no, they can't forfeit it because that's God's word, or maybe there's a future that we're concerned about. Again, going into that exact tension, is it the past or is it the future? And those are the two explanations that the Maharal goes into. So that's really what you intuited before, so that's all in source number 10. Good? Good. You're happy now, right? Yeah.
So what you say is, looking from today's perspective,
Oh no.
looking backwards, you put Moab had a future to it. But when you tell people at that particular time, and they're threatening you that Moab is going to kill you and you can't fight them, how are they supposed to know that?
Well, that's the good thing about Moshe being a prophet and God telling him what to do, which is why it's not so relevant today. So we're skipping Rashi in 11. This is the Rashi that tells us that generally Moab and Midian didn't get together, but they do get together now, which, by the way, could also be part of the explanation, is that there is this what's the term? There's this this bleeding between Moab and Midian, and the lines between them are blurred somewhat. It's not as clear. But he does point out that they hated one another, but it's the Jews bring them together because the Jews bring world peace. We bring people together. We make people love one another. We give people common goals. So, I mean, the whole collective state of Israel should get the Nobel Peace Prize because look how much we unify people. So, it's source number 12. This Orach Chaim is great. We're going to have to limit how much time we're going to go into it because we're going to very soon have a very dramatic turn. But the Orach Chaim is so good over here, and he's the one who asked the problem. He asked the question. And it really is amazing that more don't ask, what was the question? Why are we going to war against Midian if Moab was the problem, and we can't touch Moab, but because there's some future considerations, or maybe there's some yeah, so just wipe out Midian for Moab's crimes as well. So I'm saying the whole thing doesn't work that well. But he says, Nira loma kiloya isha acheret midinat mufkeret zulata. That's the hey hayidiyah, ha midyanit. Ulizagam came to Parshat Balak. She's also described there as ha midyanit behei hayidiyah. And therefore the rest of the Midian girls were not guilty of this, which is very strange because that's what Moshe is upset about. Why? I mean, these women were weaponized, is what Moshe says, and the Torah gives you no indication that that's the case other than Moshe's saying that. God would have said it initially. So again, he is the one who's spelling out this whole problem between the two. So it's also interesting, it says Moab knew their girls would be easy. I don't know how to do this in a delicate way, but when the Torah describes sexual sins, one term that it uses, which is strange, it uses the word chesed. So the girls of Moab were balot chesed, right? They performed chesed, but then again, think about the daughters of Lot. Think about where Moab comes from. Think about them, which means that for them, certain things seem to be negotiable. So therefore, for Moab, this was easy. Ladies, come out. They're all there. But when it comes to Midian, that's not at all. We keep that stuff here, right? But when it goes, sorry. Right. Midian. Right, the rest of Midian didn't do this. So now we have our wonderful midrash, which tells us one of our favorite theories, and this is our theory of conservation of characters, and therefore that this person, Sur, is actually the same fellow as Balak. And by the way, just in case you want to start up with me and the Midrash and the Orach Chaim HaKadosh and say, but they have two different names, that doesn't concern me at all, because very often when kings get appointed, they take a new name. So therefore, he is the king, and therefore that's his name. But after the whole thing doesn't work out, he goes back to his old position. By the way, that's interesting, because he originally is from Midian. He is from Midian, and then, right, remember, he's the Orach Chaim, quoting a Medrash. So he's actually from Midian. He uses his fear-mongering in order to catapult him to become the king of Moab, because look at this threat which is there. He then negotiates the agreement between Midian and Moab, because he now is both somebody from Midian and Moab, but when the whole thing doesn't work out, he gets thrown out of Moab and he gets thrown back to Midian, and then he eventually gets himself killed. And so on. And there's some other great turns of phrase that he has along the way. And here, because Ella Midianit Echad Kahn, sorry, Midian Echad, Kahn haben Shoel, Man nishtanet Midianit zu sheyatztam bikol benot Midian. What's the difference with her? The Elavade Kahu Ze Balak Asher Sachar Eleno Bilam V'yatzu V'kim Atzato B'vito V'hutzur Shezolzel B'chvodam L'kaim Eitzara Asher Bilam. This is him. It's the same guy, same anti-Semite. Will do anything to destroy the Jews. Will send his own daughter out, and so on and so forth. So as I said, the Orach Chaim, it makes a lot of progress for us, and it's at this point I think that we can now have our dramatic shift. And what's our dramatic shift? So we're done with them. War's over. We're done with them. That's Perek Lamed Aleph. And now we move to Perek Lamed Bet, which theoretically has nothing to do with anything, except unless it does. Umikne Rava Yel b'nei Reuven Gad Atzum Ma'od V'yir'u et Eretz Yazar v'et Eretz Galad v'hema makom mikne. And here we move over to the story of B'nei Reuven and B'nei Gad, as I said, which should not have anything to do with anything that we've had before. And B'nai Gad, B'nai Reuven, they come to Moshe and the Elazar and to all the leaders, and they describe the places that were captured already, which, by the way, does have a lot to do with the background story in terms of Moab and Midian and Og and Sichon and so on. Ha'aretz asher hikah Hashem, by the way, note, I want you to note the God quotient in all of this. Ha'aretz asher hikah Hashem, that means there was an act of God over here. Not to take advantage of this would be practically slapping God in an anthropological face. Ha'aretz asher hikah Hashem lifnei adat Yisrael eretz miknehi v'tam mikneh. You know, the land that God struck and essentially gave us, this land is a land for grazing. Vayomer imatzenu chen be'einecha. Now this is also an interesting shift. Yeah, God did this, but if this is okay with you. So they're not saying, what does God have to say with this? They say, what do you have to say? Moshe's in charge, right? Yutenat artzot la'avadecha, which means, again, the relationship is, Moshe, you're in charge, we work for you, and you get to make this decision. Can we have this land and stay? V'yom Moshe l'vnei Gad, l'nei Reuven, ha'achechem. Now notice that the word that he uses here is brothers. Your brothers, ha'achechem yavo l'milchama, v'atem tovshu po, v'atem teshvu po. Your brothers will go to war and you're going to stay here, which everybody uses this verse as much as they want. By the way, the verse actually would apply today to those who refuse to come to Israel and to fight together with all the soldiers that are here. It's the ones who stay outside. I know there are issues with one who are inside as well. Believe me, I have choice things to say about that as well. But I'm just saying is that's what's interesting is that you're going to stay, that you have very nice land over here, which they're saying, this is what God has given us. And they say, why do you want to frighten the people over here? Right? Ela aretz asher natan lahem Hashem. It's the land which God gave us. Again, you want to talk about God? Which is God's land? I mean, there is a God's land in all of this equation, and that just happens to be here. And then he accuses them of one of the worst things you can accuse them. And he goes, that's essentially what the spies did. And they try to put the fear in people's hearts. V'yanu alev b'nei Yisrael levilti ba el haaretz asher natan lahem Hashem. Notice, Moshe keeps coming back and saying, the land which God gave us. V'yichar af Hashem. And God was upset at that time, and so on. They followed God. V'yichar af Hashem b'Yisrael. And God was upset. And why? Ha'oser ra b'einei Hashem. My point is that Moshe's speech over here is not just that he speaks about the Meraglim. Moshe's speech over here is full of what I would call God-driven destiny, God's instructions, God-chosen land. Essentially, do you remember the book of Bereshit? Do you remember the book of Shemot? There was like kind of a theme over here. Have you lost the plot? Right? There was a place we're supposed to end up. Like, what happened to you? But Yikshu love Vayomer, when they come and they say, no, we'll go and we'll fight. Just notice till they get to the El Mikomam, till they get to their place. Not Hamakom Asher Bachar Hashem. Right? To each person gets there. So again, they've done something which is really interesting. Vayomer Aleichem Moshe, Im Tasum L'Dvar Zeh, Im Tirtzu L'Fnei Hashem. Moshe puts God back into this. V'relech Mechutz L'Diyan L'Fnei Hashem. V'nichbasha Haaretz L'Fnei Hashem. V'yitim Nikiyim Me Hashem Umi Yisrael. So again, just notice the God, right? We always do this, right? I'm very predictable. There are certain things I look for when I look at the Chumash. You know what one of them is? God, yeah. I hope that's okay. But it is really telling within this discussion. They come back and they say, we will do as you ask. And then in Kavzayin, and they realize that they have to say this because that's what Moshe kept on saying. Yeah, we're going to go and fight Lifnei Hashem. And then Vayoma Moshe, L'milchama Lifnei Hashem, and so on and so forth. So I hope you realize that so far what's taking place. Are we good? Are we good? So this is terrible. This is just terrible. As I said, lost the plot. That and the only time that they really, really focused on God is, oh, God gave us this land. You don't want to, you don't want to be so bad to God and not take the land that God gave you. But essentially they're saying is that this is a great place for us to use for grazing. And just very quickly, parenthetically, there was another suggestion that could have come up, and that we cross over and we live with everyone else and we're together with all 12 tribes on this side of the Jordan. But what about this other land over there? Well, this other land then will be used as a buffer zone, and we'll use it in order for our crops, for our flocks to graze, which means you don't need to live there for your flocks to be there, which means there was another solution without, insulting God and so on and so forth. But they could have chosen to come, but they decided that this is better for them, and that's quite unfortunate. One of the things that is real, I know that we all get, but maybe we don't pay attention to enough, and that is Moshe's initial response at one word which is really important, and that is achechem, your brothers. And that, by the way, is actually the core of the issue in modern Israel as well, is to what extent there is a sense of brotherhood. And when there is an extreme sense of brotherhood, then different decisions would be made. When there's a lack of sense of brotherhood, then other decisions are made, and that's enough to say for right now. But there's another background to all of this. Where exactly did Bnei Reuven and God get all of their possessions? Where did all these flocks come from? So presumably, the same way that the land came from, it came from these conquests that have just taken place. Maybe even one of them would have been the battle that just now took place in the previous chapter. There was a whole bunch of things that were captured. So now, they have these spoils of war, and the land captured because of war. And if you want, I can sound like a leftist now, that war corrupts and war corrupts, right? To capture other people, it corrupts, and so on and so forth. But there is something corruptive over here, and that is that they decide that they are going to put these two things together. Why bring all of these flocks over when we can keep them where they were and save on the shipping, right? This seems to make a great deal of sense. So I just want to point out now, and the path I'm about to take is one which elements of it I had heard that Rav Meidan had spoken about, although I didn't see it inside, I didn't hear it. I heard subsequently that Professor Joshua Berman had written about it. I didn't see that either, and perhaps others as well. But you'll see very quickly, I hope, why the way that I'm thinking has brought me here as well. But it is possible that I heard Rav Meidan's suggestion, and then I try to work out some details myself. I don't remember. But let's take a look. Back in Bereshit, we have a situation which is actually going to be remarkably similar, and then once you realize it, far more connected to our story than we realized before. And that is that Avram also achieves some wealth along the way. How does he achieve wealth? He went down to Egypt. And what happened in Egypt? He has this unfortunate meeting with Paro, and then we're told in source 15, V'avim kaved ma'od mikneh kesef v'zahav, and we continue, and sorry, in 14 first, Ulahavim Avram hitiv ba'ovura v'yilot son v'akar v'chamarim v'avadim v'shachar v'atanot malim. Avram gets, after Sarah was taken, Avram gets all, which is also interesting because almost a sexual inappropriate behavior almost takes place, and Avram is given all of these things, and of course they're struck, which is an early foreshadowing of the Egyptian experience. But then in source 15, Avram goes and leaves, they chase him out. And Avram now has all of this stuff that he has with him. And he travels. And Lot seems to have made a lot of money over here along the way as well. So I hope that for some of you, the fact that we're talking about Lot should be interesting, because we spent some time with Lot leading up to this point. And then we're told something very unfortunate. We're told, V'lo nasa otam ha'aretz l'shevet yachtav, ki aruch Hashem rav v'leichu l'shevet yachtav, that they couldn't stay together. V'yiriv bin roi mikneh Avram bin roi mikneh Lot, their shepherds could not get along. V'yoma Avram Lot al nati miriva b'ni u'veinecha u'bein roi u'bein recha ki anashim achim anachnu. So the achim to me is therefore very interesting, because here you have brothers, but it's interesting. Sometimes brothers live together, but sometimes brothers need to separate. And Avram over here in this case says that we need to live not together. Now that's interesting, because especially when you then continue, when you look, which land he actually takes, the land he actually takes, the descriptions are very, very similar to what B'nai Reuven and Gad, but you're going to say, no, it's actually not that far, it's only stone. Okay, fine. It's only stone, and they go one step further, but in both cases, the place that Avram is supposed to be is in Eretz Canaan, and where Lot chooses to go is all the way towards the east, and he ends up by Stone, and the place where these people choose to go is on the other side of the Jordan and is to the east, which means this Anashim Achim Anachnu, or your brother's going to go to war. So over here, clearly the conclusion should have been, but we're brothers, and therefore you need to come together and live with us and be with us, and so on and so forth. And their conclusion seems to be, well, we can be a little bit more Lot-like, and just because people are brothers don't mean they live together. And by the way, we do have Moab and Midian in the background of our story, and perhaps, again, that's something that we should pay attention to. And just by the way, and Avram says, Im smol v'iminim im yamin v'yismola, which is essentially Avram saying north and south, and then Lot goes over and he looks over to the east. So Avram did not say, let's go to different, go to the other side. He actually says north and south, and Lot chooses to go over to the Kikar HaYarden, which is again quite similar to Bnei Reuven, Bnei Gad do. Subsequently, there's going to be a war, which again, your brother's going to go to war is interesting. There's going to be a war, and that's the 4 kings against the 5 kings. And what happens during that war? Who gets captured? Lot gets captured. And how does Avraham process this? Avram is told that Lot is taken. Pasuk Yudalid v'yishma Avram ki nishba achiv. Avram heard that his brother was taken, and Avram goes to war in order to protect his brother. So again, this issue of brotherhood, responsibility, what eventually will be Moab, it's not just that we're brothers, it's that Avram, on top of everything else, is there trying to protect him. And by the way, when Lot is saved, we know, because we know the Chumash, and Lot's daughters apparently did not go to Cheder, they did not go to Beis Yaakov, because they don't know that Avram is on the background praying for them, and that's why Lot is saved, and that's the whole background of the story, and they don't seem to be aware of that. But there's one more element that I want to throw into this, and that is going back to Midian, right? Because we missed Midian in all of this. So in source 17, those who don't remember, I can't believe you don't remember, because I only said it last week or 2 weeks ago. But Yosef Avni Yikach Isha Ushmo Keturah, and there in Parshat Chayei Sarah, after all the interesting parts of Chayei Sarah, we have these like lists of people being born. But Tedel and Avram then takes another wife called Keturah, Tilo, et Zimran, Yisham, et Madan, et Midian. And one of the children of Avram at that point is Midian. So those of us who don't remember, Midian is a son of Avram Avinu. So as close as you want to say that Moab is to Avram, Midian is even closer to Avram. And therefore one can theorize, as much as Moab should have had a responsibility in order of going out and taking care of the children of Avram, Midian perhaps should have had more. But so as I said, again, there is something really interesting over here in the fact that this is Midian. Again, one of the reasons, I think one of the Rashis that perhaps I skipped along the way, was that Midian had a lot less of a concern, because geographically Midian was not in the way. They were not going to go through Midian. Midian got involved in something which wasn't theirs. They're like the Chutim. They're all far away, have nothing to do with the story, but said, oh, there's a war going on, let's go join in. Why not? Let's be a part of this. And therefore, Midian is attacked. By the way, this doesn't explain the verse that we had difficulty with, but it explains what's going on. Moab sees that they're coming, but Midian gets dragged into it, but they have nothing to do with any of this. That they had no reason for fear, because geographically they are off more to the side. Now that actually may be important where they are geographically, and everything I'm going to say moving forward will not be necessarily precise geographically, historically, because it doesn't interest me. What interests me much more is the various commentaries on the Chumash and what they're going to tell us. As we continue here, it gives us a list of other people that are born, and then it says, V'yitain Avram, Pasuk Hey, source 17, V'yitain Avraham et kol asher lo liyitzchak. Avram has one person who inherits everything which is his, and that's Yitzchak. But Avram has a bunch of other kids. I mean, notably, you know that there's a Yishmael, but now you know that there's a bunch of other kids as well. Ulevnei pilagshim, asher la'Avraham, natan Avraham matanot. And he gives presents to the others. There's some discussion what those presents are, including some strange statements in the Gemara, which Rashi quotes. V'yishalchem me'al Yitzchak beno, and he sends them away. Bodenu chai, kedma, el eretz kedem. He sends them, what does kedma mean and what does kedem mean? Sends them to the east. By the way, we like kedem. I have a grandson named Kedem, so we like Kedem a lot. But he sends them off Kedem, to Bnei Kedem, Kedma, and so on. So, the Rashbam writes, first you have to know why. What does it sound like? It sounds like, okay, let's get these guys out of the way. These are the pretenders. So let's start with the Rashbam, and then you're going to see it's echoed by a whole bunch of commentaries. Ked Maleretz Kedem, Sheyershu Banav Nachalotav Sheyesh Lo Sham. Avraham had other financial interests. Actually, Avram had his father's will. Avram had inherited other things. If you want, Avram inherited other real estate. Avram had holdings. Avram may have had flock. Avram had all kinds of things that he left behind when he left his father behind, And that's what the Rashbam is saying on what's off to the east. You want the Radak el Eretz Kedem, Omer Shalcham Klape Mizrach, he sent them to the east. Upir Shachakila Eza Eretz Mertzot Mizrach Shalcham Va'amar el Eretz Kedem, V'hu Charan V'Or Kazdin. Now, how do you get to Haran and Or Kasdim over here? Well, if you want me to make it, well, I'll make it easier for you in a moment. And it says, source 20, the Bechor Shor, Ked Mal Eretz Kedem, Eretz Aram, Kidichtiv, and he tells you to look at a pasuk. V'sholcham liresh chelko beveit aviv. He sent them to inherit Terach's and his family's possessions that Avram had rights to. Which means essentially Avram walks away from all of this, and then he has his own wealth, which he feels is given by God, and he doesn't want the inheritance from his father's old idolatry store. But on the other hand, there's other kids that now don't have anything. He goes, there are things that, absolutely you guys should be inheriting, and he sends them off to take what's theirs. In source number 20, this is the pasuk that was quoted. It's actually, ironically, who says it? Bilam says it. V'yisa mishalav v'yomar min Aram yanichenu Balak melech Moab meharari Kedem. Ibn Ezra says Kedem mizrach Eretz Yisrael. Rabbeinu Yuchas Ked mal Eretz Kedem hi Haran. That's not the first time we've seen this. K'mo shene'amar v'yelech artza b'nei Kedem. Where does that say that? That one I would hope that you'd remember, but you don't. It's fine. No judgment on my part. Source 24. Vayisa Yaakov Raglav, Vayelech Artza b'nei Kedem. Remember, that's after the dream when he heads off to find Rachel. How is it described? By the way, this should be pretty clinching for you. For all of those who just now said, oh no, this is back where Avram comes. Yeah, that there's not really that much to say. So can we try to put all of this together now? See, this is interesting. Where did we start with? We started with Moab and we started with Midian, and we don't know why we're going to war against Midian and whatever happened to Moab. And we're told that Moab, there's some future considerations, and there's also some past considerations. When it comes to Midian, we kind of ignore the past considerations, and we're not all that concerned about the future considerations. Just by the way, the Drusim claim that they come from Midian. They claim that they come from Yitro, which is also really interesting about our connection with the Drusim. But we come back now and we say, okay, we're at this point where something really wrong has taken place. But let's start thinking about another thing. Okay, B'nai Reuven, B'nai Gad. One of the things that we always want to do, aside from look for God, what's the other thing you want to do? You want to follow the money. Like, where did the money come from? So where does the money come from? The money comes from the wars that have been taking place. So therefore, we just now fought against Midian and we took all of their things. So now I'm going to ask you another question. And where does Midian's wealth come from? And it's Avraham's inheritance. So now you realize something which is really interesting. And that is, and by the way, this part, which I'm saying, I'm unaware of anybody saying this. So therefore, Midian has Avram's inheritance, and you can stand and say, no, we're taking what is really part of Avram's inheritance, and therefore this is rightfully ours, and therefore, no, this is now glatt kosher. On the other hand, this is not what Avram himself ever wanted. Avram gives everything which is his to Yitzchak, and he says to these others who are not part of, I don't know how to say this now, they're part of the Avram family, but they're not. They're not part of what will one day become Bnei Yisrael. And Avram says, oh yeah, by the way, I have these other, interests, I have these other claims that could be made. The way I said it before is perfect. I have Terach's factory that he made idols. I don't want that money. You guys can go take that money. That's fine. That's yours. So what ends up happening to this tainted money? It ends up happening is that we go and we take it. And by the way, that itself becomes really interesting. What do B'nai Reuven ben Gad say with this? Well, we want to take this and we want to stay on the other side, which is interesting because now the behavior that they're doing is very much Lot behavior. That's, again, the whole battle with Moab. On the other hand, the possessions that they're taking is Midian possessions, which then go back to Terach, which means and something which is really excluded from Am Yisrael. So therefore, when Lot separates from Am Yisrael, or from Lot separates from Avraham, because you know what, the story could have worked out differently if Lot stays with Avraham, and therefore the Avraham family community is one, Avram and Lot and children, but that's not what happens, and maybe that was never part of what was supposed to happen. So Lot separates and becomes something else, but where? That's very much what Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad do, and maybe they're fooled by that language of brothers. It's sometimes brothers separate, but sometimes brothers are brothers in a certain type of way, where even though they're brothers, Yaakov and Esav are brothers, but there's a different type of brotherhood. And Avram still feels responsible, and I'll say it again. We read that wonderful verse that Moab won't even bring water, right, and bread for you, and Avram goes to war for you, which means the brotherhood over here seems to be a little bit unequal. So therefore, when we look at this section of Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad, and I'm leaving out Manasseh, because that's mysterious how they get involved. When I'm looking at the story of Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm saying, well, take a look. Their behavior is very much like the behavior of Lot. And yeah, brothers can separate, and that's really what they feel. The fact that they took God out of the whole narrative is the issue. It means they lost the plot. They don't understand where we're supposed to be. If you have God consciousness, then this all becomes very simple, and you're supposed to buy your apartment in Israel. I'm just saying, is that all becomes a real. I did. That all becomes a simple part of this. But when you take God out of this, then you can even do that wonderful demagoguery. Look, God gave this to us. The same way that I can say, oh, look, God, quote unquote, gave Midian this wonderful inheritance. Avram gave the inheritance, but it's the inheritance of Terach. And he sent them away from Yitzchak. Again, brothers, red family. Take the Terach inheritance. And that's what's interesting, because that perhaps is this other element. So Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven end up inheriting from Moab and from Midian. And as they're doing this, there is this unfortunate type of separation from Klal Yisrael. I'll just say one thing which is interesting about all of this, and it has to do with Shemitah, because everything always comes back to Shemitah, and that is that there are always, like every number of years, we have Shemitah, and then someone will come and say, oh, soon most Jews in Israel will live most Jews of the world will live in the land of Israel, especially if this guy's elected mayor in New York. But most of the Jews in the world live in Israel, and then Shemitah becomes on a Torah level, then you can't use the Heter Mechira. Oh, that's not really true, of course, because if you actually look at the Yerushalmi, and it's the way that Rashi and the way the Rambam and others understand it, it's in order for Shemitah to work, Yovel has to work. In order for Yovel to work, you need the majority of each of the 12 tribes in their land. So until Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad are sitting in their land, Shemitah is not on a Torah law, because Shemitah is connected to Yovel. So therefore, even if all of the Jews in the world come move to Israel, Shemitah is still not on a Torah level until we can practice Yovel properly. But then again, if all the Jews in the world actually come here, just perhaps God will say, wow, they finally got the plot, and maybe it's time not to continue the way this story is supposed to end.